Old Quebec. The land in Quebec could be called rolling land, with many hills and small streams. Also, there are some fairly wide valleys in some parts. At one time, the land was covered with trees, or rather bush and timber. The hills are very rocky and can only be used for pasture, which is poor. Only the valleys are used for farming. When the land was surveyed, the center of the valley was designated as a road. Naturally, the road was not straight. All land was divided in half-mile units using the road as the front line. Each unit was designated as a homestead running half a mile deep. This would give each man about 160 acres, more or less. The homesteader could preempt the land, usually 160 acres, at the back of his land. On completion of certain specific work done on the preempted land, the title was transferred to the homesteader. Early French settlers had set up their farms around Montreal, Quebec City, and a few other locations along the St. Lawrence River. They were allowed to retain the land they had settled on after Canada became a British colony on the surrender of the French on the Plains of Abraham. From this time on, both French and British settlers took up land further and further back from the St. Lawrence. When the United States ceded from the British and formed a nation of their own, a large number of die-hard British would not go along with the separation from their mother country. They were known as the United Empire Loyalists. Wherever they were, they pulled up stakes and came to Canada. My grandparents on both sides are Loyalist stock. Mother's parents hail from the Mayflower and first settled near Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts in 1620. Being an adventurer, grandfather headed for the unknown in 1860 and was among the first settlers at Waterloo, where I was born. His homestead was 3.5 miles west of Waterloo. There were no brush cutters in those days, and his land was heavily covered with trees. Everything had to be done by hand. Grandfather was a born woodsman. I've always admired those early settlers. Seemingly with everything against them, they carved out their homes and were able to make a good home for their families, though large, and live good lives. Hard work, long hours, and tired muscles were their lot. Grandfather built well. All the buildings he put up in those early days are still standing and being used by one of his great grandsons. All are made from logs, cut, hewed, sawed, and prepared by him off his own land. There is the 2-story, 8-room log house his children were born and raised in. The big log cow barn that for several years housed 75 milk cows. It had an 18-foot high hayloft where the winter feed was stored. He built a bridge so he could drive a team into the loft to make it easier to unload the feed. Also, he could do the threshing with the old horsepower threshing machine up there and have the straw for bedding handy. The horse barn for 12 head was made of logs. It too had a big hay loft, but it had to be filled by hand. The chicken house with the large scratch pen and the hog house on the end to keep the chickens warm in the winter. It was a long log building. The long log machine shed, which grandfather insisted on being used to house all machinery not being used. He was a particular and neat farmer. The one bad feature, there may have been others, was that all his land was stony. Not big stones, but oh, so many averaging fist size. Almost as if at one time it was a gravel bed. Every time the ground was worked, stones had to be picked up. You couldn't stick a spade or fork into the ground to any depth without hitting a stone. When the potato crop was plowed up in the fall, as many stones as potatoes came to the surface. I remember I was helping cousin Murty pick potatoes. I had a sack to fill by myself. When grandfather picked up my sack, he staggered under the weight, praising me for doing so much picking. My sack was full. He asked if I was sure I had only put potatoes in the sack. I said, yes. When he got to the wagon, he couldn't lift the sack in, so emptied it out on the ground. He looked at me with a twinkle in his eye and said, "You'd better try again. This time, pinch them to be sure you are picking potatoes instead of stones." This time, I only had half a sack. That's when I learned how to tell which were potatoes and which were stones. Though I have picked hundreds of bushels of potatoes since then, I still pinch a potato when I'm not sure. As I said, there were stones everywhere. After spring and fall work was done, there were always stones to be picked and loaded on the stone boat, then hauled away and unloaded. Grandfather, being a neat farmer, would not unload the stones just anywhere. He had a use for them. He replaced his old pole fences with a stone fence. As witness the 3/4 of a mile stone fence along the main road, nearly a mile long on the west side and over a mile long on the east side, is still up and in as good a shape as when it was built. It takes a lot of stones to build a fence 5 feet wide at the base, 4 feet high, and 3 feet wide at the top. Every stone on the inside and outside of that wall had to be placed just right to stay up and hold the pressure from the center. That was the fence as it was when we left Waterloo in 1903. to go to the States. My cousin, Don Jones, was back to the old place last year. He tells me the crop of stones has not diminished over the years. There are just as many stones to pick and pile each year. They continue to build fences with them in the same old way. And the fence now extends almost 2 miles. The only difference is that the big, long, swinging gate that I had so much fun swinging on has been changed over for 2 smaller gates over the entrance way to the house. That stone fence has always stood out clear in my memory. There is a kind of mist around some of the other things, but not that stone fence. Perhaps because it was so endurable and prominent in the land, scrape in the landscape as we drove down the road to the old place several times in later years. 2, I spent many hours alone with our black shepherd dog, running along the top of the wall. It was fairly smooth and wide enough so I could not fall off. It was a dandy place for the dog and I to catch and kill those little 4-foot-long garter snakes. When the sun was hot in the afternoon, the snakes would come out of the stone fence and sun themselves on the ground. The dog would grab them by the tail, give them a shake, then throw them, and I would kill them with the old cane I always took when I went snake hunting. Marshall and Earl were too young to enjoy hunting snakes or playing away from the house. Mother was kept too busy tending my young brothers to keep a strict eye on me. As our house and grandmother's were only a few hundred yards apart, Mother expected that, when I was not home, I would be at grandmother's. If there, everything must be okay. Otherwise, she could hear my scream and see me hot-footing for home, yelling my head off, stepping high, and trying to keep my pants from touching my well-spanked bottom. I was not always at Grandma's. I went on lots of escapades they did not know about. If they had known about the snake hunts, I wouldn't have been able to sit down for weeks. It wasn't until I was mixed up with some of the other kids putting dead snakes around the schoolyard fence in the States that I became an old hand at snake handling. It was much later I learned that those little foot-long snakes that I had had so much fun with were one of the most poisonous snakes in the eastern part of Canada, and me in my bare feet, too. I wonder if the dog knew the danger and crippled them with that shaking before he threw them towards me to kill. It was spring, and the crop was seeded. Papa and Grandfather had started to pick rock. I rode the stone bolt from the field to the stone fence where the stones were piled. It was lots of fun as long as I kept out of the way. When it commenced to get cool in the evening, I went home. I was hungry, so Mother gave me my supper, then let me stay up until Papa came home. I was tired and fell asleep on the floor. It was dark, and Mother had lit the lamp. I woke up when Dad came in. As usual, I ran to him. As he picked me up, I noticed that his hands were, to me, covered with blood. There must have been blood around before this. But probing back in my memory, this was my first memory of seeing blood. I guess this had stuck with me because I thought Papa had been badly hurt. Mother had always kissed away the pain when I got hurt, and it didn't hurt anymore. Trying to ease his pain, I kissed his blood-spattered hands. He picked me up and kissed me. As he wiped the tears from my cheeks and the blood from my lips, he assured me that his hands felt much better. I watched as he washed away the blood, then ate his supper. Though he insisted that he had to milk the cows, Mother made him lie on the couch while she bathed his hands in warm water. Then she rubbed some grease on. It looked like goose grease, the same as she rubbed on my chest when I had a bad cold. She tore up one of her dish towels and bandaged his hands and told him to rest for a little while. Then he would feel better and could go and do the chores. They could wait a little longer. Papa fell asleep. Mother tiptoed over to the door and opened it very quietly. Picked up the 2 milk pails. She put her finger to her lips, then pointed to Marshall's crib. He was sleeping too. Then she pointed back to me. I knew she wanted me to be very quiet and to watch Marshall. She would have to get the cows from the pasture, then milk them. It would take a long time. I was not to wake Papa, so I sat very still. I was not used to sitting still, but I had to. Sitting still, my bottom got sore. Though I was sleeping too, my bottom hurt, so I couldn't go to sleep. All I could do was rock from side to side to ease the pain. Mother was gone a long time. I thought she wasn't coming back. Then the door slowly opened, and there she was with her pails of milk. As she carried the milk to the sink, she stepped on a squeaky board. The squeak sounded awfully loud in the still room. It woke Papa. He got up quick. Then he saw what Mother had done. He did some cussing, then put his arms around her and kissed her. Mother was sick a lot after Marshall was born. She got tired often and had to lie down a lot. There were tears in her eyes as she tucked me in bed. I did not sleep very well that night. Papa's bloody hands and Mother's tired look bothered me. I guess I was learning what worry was, even at the tender age of 3.5. The next morning, when I got up, Mother gave me my breakfast and dressed Marshall. Then she asked me to play with him because she was tired and had to lie down. Her smile was gone. She looked white. I knew she was sick. He was an awful kid to play with. every time he tried to run, he fell down and cried. Then I had to do something else, so he would keep quiet. I can't remember our dog's name. I'll call him Shep. Shep liked to play. He would get hold of Marshall's dress and tug on it. Down would go Marshall. Then more crying. He just couldn't understand that Shep wanted to play. Every time Shep came near, he would hit him. Shep finally got the idea and would not go near him. Soon as I left Marshall, Shep was ready for a round with me. Marshall was a great one for throwing anything that he could pick up. Papa said he would be a great baseball player when he grew up. It didn't work out that way. He never did play much baseball. But somehow I was able to keep Marshall busy till dinner time. Mother fed him and put him to bed for his afternoon sleep. I had my lunch, then headed over to Grandma's for some fun of my own. Shep came as far as the road. Funny, when I went over to Grandma's, Shep always came as far as the road. Then sat down and watched until I got to the house and then went back home again. He never would go all the way over with me. As soon as he saw me coming home, he would always come wagging his tail to meet me at the road. He would never cross unless I crawled up on the stone fence. When I did, he came on the run to join me. As long as I played around the stone fence, he stayed right with me. Soon as I left to go on to Grandma's, he went back home. Grandma gave me a cookie. Then I went down to the field to ride the stone boat until it commenced to get dark. When I got home, Mother gave me my supper, and I went outside again. Papa would not be home until it got so dark he couldn't see to pick stones. I wondered if his hands would be bleeding again, and would Mother have to go for the cows again. I knew where the pasture was because Papa had taken me there one time when he was looking for a little calf. It was dark, but I could not find it again. It was dark, but I could find it again. If I hurried, I could get the cows home before Papa got home. With Shep, we went down the long lane with the pole fence on each side. I remembered that. Then we came to the trees. It was a long way through. It was dark, and there was no big, bright moon to see where the path wound around among the trees. But Shep stayed ahead, and I could follow him. We came to the spring. I remembered it was on the edge of the pasture. I was through the bush, but I couldn't see the cows, and I couldn't see Shep. I stood still and called him. He didn't come. I thought he had gone back home again. I listened for the cowbell. Somehow I knew that if I could find the cow with the bell, she would go home and the others would follow her. I heard Shep bark, and then the cowbell. Shep had found the cows and was driving them home. I could see them moving towards me. They followed the same path I had come on, so I got behind them. I had to run to keep up. Papa thought he had missed me over at Grandma's, so would go over for me after he got the cows. When he heard the cow bell, he thought the cows were coming home by themselves. He opened the gate and waited. It was a big surprise to him when he started to close the gate after the cattle went through, and I called to him to wait for me. My legs were tired from running, so he carried me to the house. After the long trip of nearly 2 miles, I was ready for bed. I forgot to ask about his hands, though I know now that they were just as bad as they had been the night before. From that night on, it was my job to get the cows. Not just any time it pleased me, but get going right from the supper table. Right then, not 15 or 20 minutes later. The condition of Papa's hands was known in those days as cracked hands. It was common in both spring work and harvesting. The lips were also affected. Large cracks in the lips were painful when eating. Work in the fields commenced before the sun was up. The early morning dew caused the hands to become wet and soft. The heat from the sun and wind dried them, or rather, burned them dry. This caused the skin over the knuckles to crack and bleed. Cracked lips are not unusual these days, but we have ointments to heal or protect them. In those days, such ointments or salves, as we called such treatments, were unknown. Today we wear gloves to protect our hands. Fancy gloves made of fine cloth for special occasions were available then, but it required heavy leather gloves to withstand the rough, hard work that had to be done by hand. These kind of gloves did not come into the general use until later years. There was a simple remedy. They may have used it, but one of their strict habits of life may have prevented using it. Using this remedy does not appeal to many people. It is a sure cure, which is willingly vouched for by all who have tried it, but only after everything else has failed will a sufferer try it. It was years later, the spring we left Dad's homestead, that an elderly man who had come up from the southeastern states and homesteaded a few miles from our place noticed the condition of my cracked hands. He told me that if I would urinate in a bucket and wash my hands thoroughly in it, then leave it on my hands until morning, it would stop the pain. By using it 2 nights running, my hands would be entirely healed, and I may never need to do it again. Or, if the conditions were real bad, I might have to do it the same again in 2 or 3 years. Mother had rubbed my hands with Zambuck, axle grease, and Vaseline, but they only seemed to get worse. I could hardly close my hands to hang on to anything. They were so sore, I was willing to try anything. Though it was against my self-respect, I tried it. It was hard to believe the conditions of my hands the next morning. All soreness was gone, and the cracks were almost closed, and no scab was forming. Dad's and our hired men's hands were as bad as mine had been, and when he asked me what I had done, I told him. Both of them must have tried it because their hands were as good as mine the next day. Recalling my younger years, getting the cows up was my first job. From that day on, as I grew and got older, I was given more and more jobs to do. By jobs, I mean specified work to do, how and when to do it. If I didn't do it, or was careless doing it, I got a spanking on my bare behind with a wooden switch from the branch of an apple tree, or from the willow patch down in the pasture, which I had to go and get. Gee, that switch used to hurt, especially when I jumped around and it landed on my bare legs. As I grew past the spanking age, Father's razor strap took over. If my bottom could only talk, it could tell far better than I of the results of my foolishness and unmindful escapades in the no-nos of growing up. I learned at a very early age that when I was given a job to do, or was told to do something, I had to do it to the best of my ability. And to do it when I was told to do it, not put it off or suffer the consequences. They can be pretty tough. For some reason I cannot explain, even at my age, a job is much easier to do if done at once. The longer it is put off, the harder the job is to do. I learned another lesson too, when I was still very young. To argue about a job I was given to do was only asking for trouble for myself. I might offer suggestions about it. My suggestion may not be accepted. Well and good. I always did as I was told. With Dad, he paid for my food and clothes, therefore it was his right to tell me what to do and how to do it. If I did my job as I had been told, and it did not turn out as he expected, then it was his fault, not mine. Any trouble with or about the job was his turkey. When I worked for others, I always found that, for me, it worked out best. I learned, too, that by doing as the boss said, or agreed on, he gained confidence in my ability and trusted me, which in the long run gave me better jobs. He paid me what I agreed to accept. In exchange, I gave him what he expected of me. A job well done pays off in many ways. If you don't, or will not do what the boss tells you to do, then quit before you lower the standard you have, as every man should set for yourself. A good and proud man is one who has respect for himself and what he does.